hello and welcome to AML Gray Matters. Today is Wednesday, 16th February, 2022. I'm your host, Kimberly Smith, co-founder of Silo Compliance System and a former compliance officer and MLRO. I want to welcome our live audience. It's exciting to see our audience from all over the world, and I especially welcome the diehards joining us in their late evenings and all of the Silo Compliance System users too. It's good to see so many of you staying on top of risk management issues. Today, we have Corinna Venturi joining us from the UK. I've known Corinna for 10 years now and value her decades of experience in anti-money laundering compliance. But no matter how many years of experience one has in compliance, taking an hour to think about your basic client onboarding and risk assessment procedures is crucial to staying up to date and relevant. With so many events going on in the world, our risk assessment procedures must stay current to protect your business, and Corinna and I aim to get you thinking about your practices and find ways to improve them. Corinna, thank you for joining us today. Would you like to give us a little brief about your experience in AML?
Hi, Kimberly. Great to join you today. Very excited about our chat. Yes, as you've said, decades of experience. Dear, probably shouldn't say that. But yeah, it's such an ever-evolving thing, risk assessment, and so it's good for us to go through it. I've seen lots of, as you have too, seen lots of different ways that people do it incorrectly and correctly. Right. So we can talk about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. So before we do begin, I do want to remind our audience that this webinar is not legal advice. We will be taking questions from the live audience at the end, and we encourage your questions. And today's webinar, we anticipate will last approximately 1 hour. For those of you who need certificates, they will be auto-generated and sent to you via email approximately 1 hour after the end of the broadcast. There are no handouts today, but slides and a recording of this broadcast will be sent out in a few days. Usually by Friday, we get that email out to you. I do have a few polling questions for our live audience. Your responses help us know who is listening in and helps us address some of the issues you may be facing. So Tom, would you mind launching the first poll question? So I think the first one is, how do you feel about your client risk procedures? Again, if you just take a few moments just to answer that. And a big thanks to Tom Gardner, who is working behind the scenes launching these polling questions. So this question was, I'm asking you, are your current risk assessment procedures easy to understand and complete? Tom, do you want to go ahead and close that? So we have 47% saying yes, they're easy and to understand and complete. 47% are saying somewhat. Thankfully, we only have a couple people who are saying that no, that they're way too complex, and that can happen. And so just a few percent are saying that it's not applicable to them. So go ahead and launch the next question, Tom. And this is asking you to kind of give us an idea what your last audit of your AML compliance procedures kind of revealed. Great, so this is looking good. So it looks like a pretty good majority are saying that your last AML audit did say that you did require some improvements. Good, all right, you want to go ahead and close that one, Tom? Okay, so 58% said it did require, sorry, I can't read the whole thing, but it looks like it's saying that it did require some improvements. 15% no changes were needed. 21% don't know, probably because you're not involved in audits, and 7% said you had some major deficiencies. So hopefully we can help those of you who have some major deficiencies. And one last polling question before we get started. And this is going to help us assess what you are wanting out of your risk assessment procedures. Trying to find out if you're looking for simpler ways, reduce the time, if you're looking for some more automation. As technology does mature, there are some automation tools out there. We won't be talking about those today, but maybe we can talk about those in a future webinar. Okay, fantastic. Go ahead and close that, Paul, if you don't mind. So majority of you, it seems to, and this was you could select multiple ones. So 68% are saying you want simpler risk assessment processes. I hate to disappoint you. I think one thing Corinne and I are going to be talking about is how complex it really is. 64% to reduce the time. And of course, 55% are saying you want more automation. So, and some of you are wanting to reduce your compliance cost and overhead. Yeah, I think that's pretty common, really. And 8% looking for a bigger budget. So as one of my phrases is pick your battles. So yeah, thank you very much for that. So go ahead and hide that question. Fantastic. So to kick off our discussion, I wanted Corinna to give us some ideas, and Corinna and I both will give our input. So some of the things that we've seen in our 10+ years of experience in AML, working with different companies. It's both small and large. So Corinna, let me know, what's the worst client risk assessment practice that you've come across?
I love this question. As I mentioned earlier, when we were chatting amongst ourselves, that the worst one I've ever seen actually was really recently. And the client, I was helping them obviously update their procedures, thankfully. And the client, their compliance person was just looking at a file and putting what risk level they thought it was on the file. Just writing it, no idea, no recording of how they came to that conclusion. Okay. It was just placed on the file, and that was that. Now, the reality is that they were, assessing it in accordance with their procedures, which were not, too bad, apart from that obvious glaring missing piece of information. But they just weren't recording it properly. That was the major problem. But it looked terrible. So anyone coming in to do an audit or any sort of assurance review or anything like that, that's all they see. They don't know what's going on because they haven't basically recorded the information properly.
Right. That's a pretty simplified process, though.
Very simplified. That's high risk.
Yeah, exactly.
I won't tell you how I know that, but it is.
Yeah. Whereas I saw the opposite. My worst was it had over 20 steps in the process. I mean, it was just pages and pages and pages of forms, and so I thought they had overcomplicated. So it's interesting that yours is one way, and my worst, assessment practice that I've seen is too complex.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Yeah, you can totally do that and just spend so much time, and then you're kind of losing, the real reasons for doing it. That can be, you can get absolutely mired in paperwork, and lose the real reason as to why you're doing it. Right.
And of course, I guess, that leads to the second question. If there was one thing that they could do to improve it, what would you have them do immediately? And I guess your answer to that is...
Well, that one was obvious. I mean, that was such an exceptional case. So obviously, I set them up with a weighted scoring risk assessment matrix and, showed them how to use it. And they, then they could put their what's going on in their heads onto the matrix and actually evidence what they were doing.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's all about showing, demonstrating to the regulator your thinking behind your thought processes, because everybody's a little bit different.
Yeah, and you've got to always be thinking of that, in any aspect. Is this good enough? Is this information good enough for someone coming in, a regulator, auditor, or whoever? Are they going to understand what's going on in this file? Just without me saying anything. That's what you've always got to be thinking of when you're thinking of recording and evidencing your work.
Right. Okay. And what's the most common gap that you've come across?
I think in terms of risk assessment itself, it's that firms aren't updating their process in line with internal updates. So it might be things that have come up in their business-wide risk assessment, or changes in products or services or something, or maybe legislative or sanctions changes and things like that. So you need to make sure that it's not just a fixed sort of process, that it's being updated as needed.
Okay, that's a good one, because I have seen too where if I'm working with somebody, making sure they document what their trigger events are. Not just we're going to review our procedures every 1 to 2 years, but we're going to review our procedures when we hire a new compliance officer, or when we offer out a new product or
Yeah,
service, or when we
absolutely.
implement a new system, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's a very common gap that I'm seeing as well. Trying to think in terms of yeah, one of the ones I saw was documenting the periodic review or the ongoing monitoring requirement procedures.
Yeah,
I see a lot of people where they just kind of say, yeah, we're going to review all our high risk once a year or every 6 months, and
yeah.
our normal or low risk every couple of years, something like that. But documenting what is going on whenever you are doing your periodic reviews or your ongoing monitoring procedures, documenting that is a common gap that I see.
Yeah, definitely.
And what, if anything, is a common practice that you would want to transform?
I don't know. It's a tough one, really. There's a common practice. I don't know. I think just generally speaking, I think there's a bit of a lack of understanding about the whole risk assessment process and how it kind of fits into everything that you're doing when you're onboarding, or for ongoing monitoring with your customer. I think staff need to kind of pull out a little bit and see the big picture. I think that's what I see, is that it's like it's looked at as a single thing, and then they move on to the next thing, whatever that is. Getting all their documents in and blah blah blah. But I think really looking at it in its entirety, I would like to see as being more common, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny you say that, because that's exactly what I was kind of saying. It was, looking at that bigger picture when onboarding. And I was particularly focused on the reliance on data service providers to identify things like PEPs and high risk persons. And, just kind of want to say, just because somebody's name is not in a particular database does not mean that they are not high risk, or that they
Absolutely.
are not a PEP. You really have to, especially in the smaller jurisdictions, like I work a lot with, in the Caribbean, and, a smaller jurisdiction might have some PEPs that, that you would say, hey, that person's a PEP, but is not necessarily in a bigger screening providers database, simply because it's a smaller jurisdiction. So
absolutely. And you can always first point to that is that you have to have a bit of local knowledge in that case, and understand
right.
who you're dealing with, and do further checks on that person. Because if you're looking at them anyway, you're going to see what they do for a living and XYZ, and you can't go, oh, okay, they're technically a PEP, but they're not on whatever screening tool you're using, so I won't class them as one. So that's absolutely
Right.
correct. You don't just use that. And then the other thing is, that I think people don't realise, is you can reach out to your screening tool and say, by the way, this person is a PEP and here's why. And they'll add them. They'll add them if they agree with you. They'll add them to the database. So you're kind of helping them as well, and other people.
Yeah. No, and we do that several times. Reach out to screening tools and say, hey, this one didn't pop up. Can we get it added? Yeah. Absolutely.
I've done that.
Okay. So this is a slide that I put together because I have seen people use this kind of matrix before. And although it says it's a qualitative risk assessment, because they kind of do some factoring there, my issue with this is that it is still very subjective, because you're having to make the call before something happens of the probability and severity of an incident. So I still think it's quite subjective when you're onboarding a client. One of the things that I've whenever I was kind of in the hot seat and trying to do the risk rating, was always trying to look at somebody and saying, okay, if they hit the press in 5 years from now, have I done everything that I could do now? Have I done everything today that could tell me if this person's going to hit the news in 5 years? Is being a money launderer or being involved in terrorist financing, or of course, we're also looking at business risk as well, reputational risk. Is this person going to hit the headlines for fraud, or accounting fraud, or tax evasion, or something like that? So it's a kind of a heavy burden to bear for the traditional analyst whenever they're having to think about that when they're trying to protect their firms or companies reputation as well.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, so it's a quite stressful job, really. Then, of course, our 3 criteria that we're really going to be talking about today is the country and geographic risk, products and services risk, and of course, the client risk. Those are the scope of today's conversation. I do realize that a lot of businesses, whenever they are onboarding new clients or customers, they are also looking at, again, that reputational risk. They might be looking at credit risk and any kind of other business related risk. But we are really focusing today on just the AML and terrorist financing risk of your client or customer. But to go back to why kind of our comments earlier about some onboarding procedures are so complex, is because I do think they take into consideration the more complex onboarding procedures might take into consideration, the business risk, reputational risk, and credit risk of a new customer and client. So it could very well be that your onboarding procedures do consider those factors as well. So just kind of expand a little bit more. What do you want to kind of kick off on? Let's talk a little bit about the country and geographic risk of the risk assessment procedures. And these are just a few bullet points that we've added to our slides today to give you some takeaways. So Corinna, what are you seeing when you see your clients looking at country and geographic risk?
Yeah, so you've got to ask yourself, a series of questions to understand, where, about jurisdictions, countries, where is your customer based? Where are they sending money to or receiving money from? Things like that. Have they got any assets in there? Where are they held? So you're asking yourself all of those questions. But then, once you know that, you've obviously got to apply, well, what does that mean? Are any of those countries high risk? And then, how do I know if it's high risk? That's such an important thing. You're going to have your databases and your lists and what have you. But are you sure that you've got, up-to-date current information? Kim, you mentioned previously in one of our conversations about how quickly things can change, and so you've got to make sure that you're up to date with that at all times, so that that when you're asking these questions and looking at these risk factors for a customer, that you're able to correctly apply it and help with your overall assessment.
Right. And I think this is a particularly tricky area for those who are listening in who have international client and customer portfolios. Just taking, the whole Russia-Ukraine. So, let's look at some context of what's going on, today, mid-February 2022. We've got, the situation in Ukraine, on the Ukrainian border, going on that can change in a heartbeat, according to US media, at least. I don't know what the rest of the world is reporting. But we also have situations like the trucker convoy in Canada. I don't know if that's hitting the press over in the UK right now, but it's kind of mainstream media here. And
no, I've not seen that yet.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so apparently there's a situation where there's a GoFundMe. The truckers are protesting against the vaccine mandates in Canada, and there was a big GoFundMe raise that raised like $10 million in donations to support those truckers who are not working right now because they're protesting. It's been going on for a couple of weeks.
Right.
And of course, then, so, and long story short, everybody can kind of look it up afterwards. But long story short, apparently now in Canada, and don't quote me on this because the news is always changing. Apparently, if you, the Canadian government is saying if trying to monitor Canadian banks to see who donated, if that, I mean, that's just what I heard this morning. I just thought I would not want to be a compliance officer at a Canadian bank right now, simply because of that. So,
Wow.
yeah, so there's that's going on, and yeah, just so much. It's just daily, and those are two really big things going on.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, particularly with the Ukraine one. So any news that's coming out of the US is really, as you said, very sort of strongly worded towards, potential war. And
Right.
it's kind of the same here, but then I was listening to, one of the major newspapers podcasts, and, they were speaking to ordinary people on the ground in Ukraine. And,
Mm-hmm.
they were just kind of going about their business and,
Right.
not, all right, yes, worried, yes, concerned that something awful is going to happen, but, they're not kind of hiding away in bunkers or anything like that at the moment. So you don't know where you are. And I
Right.
think
Right.
there's a danger, isn't there, of getting caught up in all of this stuff. But until, you know, there are, let's say, sanctions placed upon a country or upon certain transactions, etc., what can you do apart from stay as up to date as you possibly can?
Mm-hmm.
How far do you go with like changing procedures and things like that without, when at the moment it's just a story in the news and not really anything concrete, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Kind of, you don't want to be too reactive,
Yeah.
but at the same time, your assessment procedures need to think about, okay, if I'm onboarding somebody today who has, high has connections to, Russian government, for instance.
Mm,
How is that going to look 6 months down the road when, NATO and Russia are at war,
mm,
kind of thing.
mm.
So, and does that, and impact us? Again, it might not, depending on where you are. So,
Yeah.
yeah, and the
And
products and
I,
services
I
you
think
provide.
that goes back again to this kind of proper evidencing of things. So,
Mhm.
if you're in a real tricky sort of quandary about a customer or a change in a customer due to something like that, have a conversation, sit with, the people within your firm or external consultants if you need, additional expertise, and go through it and, take minutes of your meeting and write it all down, and then talk about, write down how you've reached your decision about whether to keep that client, for example. If you can
Right.
demonstrate your thought processes, and the rationale for all of the decisions, then I always think that that helps.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's good. Okay, one of the second one, products and services risk. And this is actually one of the other gaps that I see where people don't or businesses do not do a full business risk assessment and actually look at every single product or service that they provide, break it down, and then analyze it from okay, could this be used for money laundering? Could this product that I'm providing be used for, terrorist financing? And I appreciate you actually put in some examples, things like the pooled accounts, fiduciary deposits, and things like that. So, but that's another aspect in the kind of the three criteria when you're looking at the assessment that I've seen, is that you want to think about it. I've seen a lot of people just look at country, like somebody's nationality and address, to determine a risk rating, and they don't actually look at what that particular customer client is wanting from them.
Mm.
Do you see the same thing as well?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's so key. It's such a key part of it. You know, what do they, you know, what service do they want from you, and why, and does it fit with, you know, their profile, you know, and the types of customers you typically have. Yeah, I think that's, you know, like you say, we've got some examples there as well. So you've got to look at the risk of that, because you might have one type of customer using a service, but because of who they are and where they are, that service is less risky. You know, so you've got to, again, you're looking at all of those aspects together, but you certainly can't just leave that out altogether. And in a broader sense, you need to be looking at your product and services risk again at that, you know, your business-wide risk assessment. You know, I see quite often, like I mentioned earlier, that, you know, businesses will start providing a new service or product, but they haven't assessed it for risk, generally speaking.
Right.
And you must do that.
Yes, absolutely. Especially when there's so many new things going on out there. I mean, I think just in the past couple of years, I mean, we've got, is it NFTs? We've got SPACs, we've got all the cryptocurrencies. I see, you know, initial coin offerings. That was a big deal a couple of years ago. And yeah, so I mean, and whether or not that is maybe a source of somebody's wealth or funds, you've got to think about it, or if it's a product or service that you're providing, or somehow that's somehow you have to also think about if your client is involved in these new technologies or new methods, or just something new that's out there, because it seems like every couple of years there's some big thing going on, especially in the technology world.
Yeah, and then you find yourself having to gen up on all of that and suddenly become an expert overnight, which is just not possible. So, you know,
I mean, I was even thinking about, like, I was even thinking about ICOs the other day. I mean, I think it was a couple of years ago, ICOs, initial coin offerings, were just always, they seem to be happening constantly. And I don't know, maybe I've just tuned them out, but I'm not hearing about them anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
And the other ones that I was kind of trying to pay attention to, you know, again, a year ago, were SPACs, which was special purpose acquisition companies. And I don't know if that's a big deal elsewhere in the world, but here in the US, you know, they kind of became quite popular. So I was kind of trying to learn about those as well. Okay. The third item is the customer risk. And we won't go into PEPs in detail because that is a webinar in itself. But obviously, as we kind of mentioned, you know, finding out if your customer is a PEP, and not just relying on those databases to, you know, confirm that somebody's a PEP or not, but, you know, using the knowledge that you have on your purpose, on your individual, and things like the purpose of the relationship. I do find a lot of people, or a lot of businesses, don't really think about that, and maybe because it's so intuitive. Of course, you know, if I'm a law firm, they're coming to us for legal advice, or if my accounting firm, you know, maybe, you know, they're coming to us for accounting advice, or so maybe that's the reason why it's not really documented as often as I'd like to see. Are you seeing the same thing, where the purpose of relationship's not well documented?
I mean, it can be, but it's from what I see here in the UK, that sort of nature of the relationship tends to be a thing that is, you know, explicitly asked. How deeply people go into it depends on, you know, what's who, you know, what that service is particularly, or what the firm is. But yeah, I do see it fairly regularly. But I think you're right. I think there is that. It's kind of baked in as well, isn't it, into, you know, everything else you're doing when you're onboarding a customer. You know, why they're using your services, you know, what they do for a living, that sort of thing. So you should be kind of gathering all of that information anyway.
Okay. Durational relationship. I mean, I think in some regulations they say you don't have to do diligence on just, if it's under a certain threshold or if it's just kind of a one-off relationship. I don't know if that's still the case globally.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's
Okay.
certainly the case in Europe and the UK. So you can have one-off transactions or under a certain threshold,
Hmm.
and then it's like minimal information. So you might take an ID and just
Okay.
get name, address, date of birth, but all the rest of it is not necessary in those cases.
Yeah. But of course, you still have to think of terms of that was a one-off, but then as you come back again 6 months later, and
Yes.
it's another one. Yeah. So you have to think
And
about
yeah,
the
so yeah, you find it in money service businesses
right.
predominantly, and they need to be using technologies where they can pick up, if someone's kind of starting, if they've got linked transactions, for example, so they've sent their transfer, it's a small amount one day, then they send another one the next day and the next day and the next day. Well, then
Yeah.
it's become a linked amount, and you've got to look at it. But a lot of software technologies that they're using will pick that up.
Right. Okay. The delivery channel risks, such as and of course, I think the phrase delivery channel means things is different to some. I've always seen delivery channel is how they came to you, how they
Mm-hmm.
um, started using your business, and again, that might be like an introduction, some intimate, like a law firm, intimate, kind of introducing the business to you. But then there's also some people are like, well, the delivery channel is also how they do business with their customer. Is it always via email? Is it always through? I mean, do they ever meet face to face?
Yeah.
Is it all? I mean, so like a bank might be. Well, most of our banking is done online,
Mm.
for instance. So you do think about what type of industry you are in and that delivery channel risk as well, and what it means to you as far as and what it means to your regulator as well, because I think the
Yeah.
regulations can be different.
And obviously that changed. If you were a business that was more handshake and face to face before, now
Hmm.
we're you know uh, in the pandemic, post pandemic, whatever.
Right,
All of that has changed for so many firms, and so you've got to make sure that your risk assessment has kept up with that. If you're no longer
right.
able to meet people, and it's those types of businesses that tend to be high risk customers anyway, the ones that
Hmm.
where you are meeting them typically before onboarding them. It's usually because you're dealing with maybe high net worth individuals um, or or something like that. So you've got to make sure that, okay, if you're not meeting them face to face, are you absolutely sure you're dealing with who they say they are?
Absolutely. And interestingly enough, because I was even kind of thinking, okay, well, even a conference, a video conference, for instance, for a new
Mm.
client, is that deemed face to face if you're seeing them,
Mm.
on a conference? And of course, but then there's another question. We did a webinar, I think it was last September, on deep fakes and how somebody
Mm.
could fake a video call and you think you're speaking to Matt Damon, for instance, because he's everybody knows his face, um, but somebody could fake that their image, and yet it's moving
Mm.
around, and so it looks like you're speaking to Matt Damon. Um,
Mm.
so and I thought that was very interesting as well. So that just kind of throws another wrench in the
It
works.
does. It does and it doesn't. Because I'm so fascinated with things like that.
Yeah,
But I think, although the technology is there, it's still so complex and complicated, and so few people know how to do it
yeah,
extremely effectively, that I think at this stage, you'd have to be an extremely determined criminal to be, going through those measures, and and it's got to be so economically worth it to you to have,
yeah.
to have gone through that. So I think the chances are pretty slim, but that's just now. I mean, that stuff's out there, and who knows how quickly. We know already how quickly technologies develop.
Yeah.
So yeah, certainly always worth keeping up to date with things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. To just figure out how because they are coming up with some new and interesting and creative ways. And of course,
Mm,
that size and type of transaction, we were kind of talking about that and how they could be linked. But then also, does the transaction make commercial sense?
mm,
Um, that's, again, this is probably especially true for law firms who are, providing advice and contracts in these big
mm,
commercial deals, making sure that they understand the flow of the money and that it does make all sense.
mm,
Um, and does it align with the client profile?
mhm,
That's another key one that I think a lot of people probably miss um, as well. I don't know if you've had any experience with that.
mm. Yeah, definitely. It's a massive red flag, isn't it? If
Mhm.
if you've got a transaction that just does not make sense, but you've got to be, your processes have to enable you to spot that. So, okay, if you're a smaller firm with a smaller client portfolio where you kind of know them individually, you tend to be better at spotting those sorts of things. But um, much larger firms where there's a lot more automation, you know,
Mhm.
are your automated processes able to capture things like that? It's really important.
Right. One of the examples that I have of this is when I mean, so for corporate entities that you have to kind of drill down and look into, directors and shareholders and management. And I've come across this where suddenly somebody's appointed to the board that whenever and one part of me, you kind of have this internal fight. It's like, well, is it my job to decide who can be appointed to the board? No, it's the shareholders, jobs and however that company's set up. But then sometimes looking at somebody who's getting appointed to a board and realizing that that they have absolutely no experience in that particular
Mm,
industry that particular company is supposed to be operating, and then having to question why is that person
mm,
sudden, maybe they have experience elsewhere, but just kind of, and it's not necessarily saying, okay, I'm going to make them higher risk because they have none of that experience and why they're appointed to that board, but just kind of making a mental note or even documenting it that,
mm.
because I mean, I was always thinking in terms of are they being paid a bribe and this is how they're getting
Yeah,
paid by, by saying, okay, we'll point you to the board, you don't have to do anything, but we'll give you 100 grand a year to grease the wheels or
yeah,
something like that.
yeah, exactly. It's really important. It's important to note those things, like properly note those things, and properly note how you've dealt with them.
Right.
Something like that. Always ask questions. You should be able to ask questions.
Hmm.
And if you get real pushback on those questions, again, that's a red flag, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
You've got to, if something isn't making sense to you, you've got to keep digging until it does. And if it never does, then it's, you have to start questioning whether you can onboard something like that or continue with that customer.
Yeah. I think there'd have to be a few red flags that go up.
Mm,
That being one of them, if I was concerned about, somebody's sitting on a board. Um, the other thing, going back to the kind of like the type of transaction in a second, I think I did a webinar where a couple months ago, we were talking about, and I brought up, I don't know if this made the news worldwide, but it was the college admission scandal where
yeah,
coaches were getting paid, some of them up to 100 grand, 500 grand a year, or not a
that's
year,
right.
but a transaction as a bribe to then get some of these students accepted, into
Mm.
certain colleges. So I don't know if that made kind of world news, but I remember kind
It
of
certainly
thinking,
did,
how did
yeah.
those people, yeah, how did those coaches get that $500,000 payment into their banks? It's when
Yeah,
I'm sure their salary was probably less than 100 grand or maybe 100, something. Then all of a sudden they get this big chunk of change. Did their banks not question
mm,
that?
mm.
So that's
Yeah, or
something.
how there was the guy, wasn't there? The guy who was like the central, you know, um, character in it.
Yes,
who was
yeah, he was the one
facilitating
that
it.
was paying. Yeah, because
Yeah,
parents were
yeah.
paying
So
him. Yeah,
I imagine he was kind of papering, creating the necessary paper trails because he was so shady, that guy, wasn't he?
yeah,
And
yeah,
all the things he was doing. There's quite a few famous people, weren't there, that
yeah,
popped
yeah.
up
Quite
having
some.
got their kids into college
Yeah,
through those means. Yeah.
yeah. That was just kind of an interesting case to
Mm,
follow as well. So yeah, and of course, looking at the beneficiaries of transaction, this is probably a little bit more related for those trusting corporate service providers. Especially people who are setting up trusts in the States for wealth managers. And of course, also looking at what the transaction itself is related to. So such as, the arms and metals and cultural artifacts, religious, anything that has religious significance.
mm,
And we're especially looking mostly, I think, for, especially in the war-torn countries where
mm.
archaeological items and historical items can be kind of stolen from that country and
Yeah,
sold on the black
yeah.
market.
And you've got to be so careful. Just to touch on that sort. I mean, obviously, it's a whole other webinar to talk about,
Mhm.
evidencing transactions and source of wealth and things like that. But it's such an important thing. And if you don't have the expertise to do it, because some of these things can be so, particular, can't they?
Yeah,
You have to consider whether you can take it on, and don't just go, oh, well, I don't really know much about that, but I'm sure it's fine.
yeah,
You've got to, does it fall within your risk appetite to do a transaction like that, and within your expertise?
yeah.
And
And
if not, you shouldn't be doing it.
yeah, and this kind of reveals right here. I mean, we're only talking about three things, three criteria that we're looking at for our risk assessment, but how detailed these can go, when you start digging down. So you almost have
Mhm.
to have geopolitical knowledge, what's going on in the world, stay very much up to date, stay up to date as far as, particular um, assets, stay up to date
Mm,
on business transaction, what's current, so it's again, it's a heavy load to bear for, one analyst to do, if you have a very wide client portfolio
mm,
that's doing a little bit of everything. So you can imagine that this mentally hard for the average analyst, and so they will need a lot more support, just in constant training, I think,
mm,
so they can stay on top of this, as well as maybe, as you say, kind of being able to have somebody outsource that they can call on that might have a bit more
mm.
experience and um,
Yeah, people
yeah,
have to be careful because you try and do all this yourself. I think you and I have both been in this situation
you're
many
gonna miss
moons
something.
ago, where yeah, and it's you're expected to know everything about everything, but the thing I always think is you don't know what you don't know, and so
Yeah,
it's you've always got to reach out, into the compliance community and get further expertise, and not try and take on all of this yourself if it's very complicated. Um,
right.
there's a lot of lone compliance people out there in the smaller firms, and just I would say, particularly to them, be careful and make sure that you're using external resources as well.
Right. And to the senior management, I would say, make sure you budget in your annual budgets those resources for them. And again, it could just be, again, ongoing training, going to conferences, attending conferences virtually, where they do dive down deeper into these particular things. So I went to one,
Absolutely.
I was attending one last September, and there was a particular topic on just China, onboarding a Chinese
Mm,
client. And I just thought it was fascinating because there was just so much just on that one nationality
mm,
that I hadn't, did not know about. And I thought that is just, I was like, gosh, that's a whole day of learning right there.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so there's so much. That's what I would say to the senior management whenever you're looking at your budgets for compliance. Just do bear in mind, it's if you have an international client portfolio or customer portfolio, this is some of the things that your analyst is having to think about. Let's move on a little bit about weighting, because I have seen customers that use weighting. Even the silo system, there's some ability to do some weighting as well. And I thought your comments were really good as far as, because I have seen this, especially this third one here, weighting should not be unduly influenced by just one factor. I have seen that, as well as the attempt to work their weighting to where it was almost impossible to classify any of their clients as high risk. And so clearly, since you wrote that, I'm assuming you've come across the same thing.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, because in the UK and many places around the world, we work under the risk-based approach. It means that you're not completely prescribed how you have to do these things, so it's up to firms to figure out how they make these matrices. But having said that, there are regulations in the UK and in other countries, and you've got to follow those. So whilst they'll be tailored to your business and your customer base and your firm, they still have to be within those regulations, and that's the key area. And it's interesting that, just going back to the shouldn't be unduly influenced by one factor, and that's true, but not to be confused with, if you have a PEP in your risk rating,
Right.
and nothing else is high risk about the business, that file's still going to be high risk, likely. Not always, but it depends on the level of PEP. But you could actually, there are some scenarios where it could be influenced by a single factor, but it would be clear in the file why it was.
Right. Okay. All right. Fantastic. Moving on to the escalation. This is something else where I have seen a little bit. I'm seeing more escalation, or where something's high risk or has certain factors, they might get moved up to somebody more in senior management or even the board before a client can be onboarded. So I am seeing more of it, but I think I'd say 10 years ago, I almost rarely saw it. Especially, and this is actually really hard in the smaller firms too, because sometimes there's no one to escalate it to. So you do have that problem. But yeah, being able to document that you do have an escalation procedure in place. And it could be too where it's not just necessarily the client risk. And maybe this is where it's so focused on, if the client is high risk, maybe it gets escalated. But I think some people forget about that product and service risk as well. Maybe there should even be some products or services that if somebody comes in and is needing it, has to be signed off.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one that springs to mind that more a few years ago, but still see it every now and again, is tier 1 investor visas over here, which is like the golden visa, they were called before. I mean, immediately, you would see that product as high risk, but many of the firms offering that didn't. You might look at they'd look at the customer, because often they were coming from high risk jurisdictions, but that product itself, I think, is by its very nature.
And I also kind of wrote, to senior management boards, they really need to be welcoming to escalation procedures. I know a lot of senior management, and especially when they get to board level, compliance might not be their strength or their forte. They might not know anything about it. Maybe there needs to be somebody who's assigned in senior management or on the board to accept those and kind of take them on board themselves, so it's not just kind of going generally to a big board. But those kind of things also need to be, again, these escalation needs to be kind of welcomed by them and addressed as to who's going to be the one person in senior management or the one person on the board who's going to.
That's right. And depending on the size of your firm, you should have terms of reference for your committees or your board and things like that. And over here in the UK, that there should be someone at that level who is in control of AML. They're not necessarily doing all the day to day, but there should be a person that's assigned with that responsibility. So you'd expect that they would be involved in any sort of escalation there. And so some firms have separate risk committees as well.
Those are usually the larger firms.
Yeah,
they've got more people that can make up all the different committees. Lucky them. And of course, there might be certain triggers too you want to document. So, for instance, because like I know, in the Caribbean, there's a lot of specific certification wording that has to be followed. So maybe that's a trigger event. I know that's kind of frustrating for some. Or maybe some news article was found, that on the person that maybe you want to think about whether or not that is a trigger event that gets escalated as well. And of course, if that risk rating or score increases at any time, so you might onboard somebody, in their medium or low risk, but then something happens and then suddenly they become higher risk. So whether that's through your ongoing monitoring process that you discover that they're higher risk, or maybe have some kind of automation going on, maybe that again it needs to be escalated up. And and just to point out, anytime you do have a high risk, I think most regulations require that you then have to do enhanced due diligence, and often that means getting source of wealth, source of funds. And I do realize that's the reason why so many people try and they shy away from making somebody high risk, because they don't like that extra work, really. But I personally don't have a problem with making somebody high risk. There's always a way to do that enhanced due diligence and get that source of wealth, document that source of wealth and source of funds.
Absolutely.
We are not going to go into, because again, that's a whole nother topic.
I think that goes back to, just briefly, to say that, that's about senior management looking at budgets for their compliance teams, because if you're shying away from high risk because it increases frequency, you're probably overburdened with work, which means you need more hands to help. There shouldn't be any sort of shying away from that.
Right, absolutely. Okay, next slide is about ongoing monitoring. I see this is one of my more common gaps that I see people missing, is documenting how they do their periodic reviews. I see they'll document things like, they'll say, okay, if they're high risk, I'll review them once a year, and if they're low risk, I'll review them every 3 years, something like that. But they don't document what that review process looks like. So it's not just how frequently, but what does it entail? And also the event triggers that would also trigger a review, like before that once a year, once every 3 years, review. So that's just something that I have seen, to the point where I even wrote an article. So maybe if I remember, I'll even try, whenever I send out the recording of this, I'll try to attach that article, but if not, you can always go to our website on Silo. So I'll send a link to that at least, about ongoing monitoring and what you might want to add. I'm assuming you probably see similar situations.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, period reviews are funny sometimes. They seem to get a bit left behind. It's like, oh yeah, we do this, but when you're looking at a firm's processes, they're sometimes just not as clear as the onboarding processes. And yeah, the actual keeping customer information up to date, can be a little bit light touch, and like you say, not putting their precise triggers down. What would actually trigger a review outside of the normal one.
Right.
So yeah, firms really need to to treat that as carefully as they do with onboarding, because that is, like you put at the end of the slide there, that's how you're mitigating your risk. By checking regularly. How regularly depends on the risk, as we've said.
Right.
But you need to be, going through that risk. That's another thing that I see often doesn't happen, is they don't reclassify the risk as a whole. They don't go through that weighted scoring again at review time, which you should do every single time. And certainly with a trigger, something has changed, so it might be, it might, the risk rating may never change throughout the life cycle of that customer, but without testing that and documenting it, how do you know?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely see that. And of course, in that last question, can review frequency mitigate risk? I mean, yes, as far as you're obviously reviewing them, but I don't think one could say, well, if I take this high risk person and review them every 3 months, I'll make them normal risk. So I just want to kind of make that clear that that's not what we mean there.
Absolutely not. It doesn't matter if you reviewed them every day.
Every
still
day,
going to be
high risk.
But you're kind of keeping up to date with that person, that company, whatever it might be, and their risk to you as a business. And the more frequently you do that with a higher risk customer, the less likely you are to get caught out by something. So that's really the point of that, rather than changing the actual risk classification itself.
Okay. Coming up to the top of the hour, and again, we will take questions from the audience here soon. One last slide before we get to the Q&A session is, how, if you're listening in, what could you do to improve your current processes? Now, the one thing that I do whenever I'm working with somebody, and as we're about to implement, the silo system, is I like to understand their current processes. And the one thing I do is I do a lot of flowcharts and just understanding their every single step in their current process. And that really helps me figure out who does what. So especially when we're configuring the system for them, but then also understanding where their gaps are. And I have seen that where I'll kind of go through their risk manual process, procedures, and then go, well, what happens when this happens, and because they don't have it documented very well. And so we can at least update their manual, but then also configure the system for them better. So that's something that I do. Is there anything that you do whenever you're looking at a client's procedures?
It's pretty much exactly what I do. So it tends to be, if I'm doing, if I'm helping a client with their procedures, I'll start with facilitating a business-wide risk assessment with them. So looking at, not just the customer risk assessment, but obviously their business risk assessment. And that's like exactly as you've explained. It's mapping their processes. It talks about their products and services and the risk to them and all of that. And out of that, we look at and we see the gaps that they have in their current processes and fill them in. So yeah, it's pretty much the same process.
Right. And just to again clarify, a lot of people think workflow processes are very linear. They just step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. But that's never the case, really, in reality. The reality is you might have, get their KYC, do some due diligence and sanctions checking, but then you've got, well, then if they are normal risk, this happens, and if they're higher risk, this needs to happen. So it's more of a map as opposed to just a step-by-step checklist process.
Yeah, definitely. And you've also, there's also always going to be areas in there where you're going to have to kind of step out of that workflow. So it's just to guide the firm, really, isn't it?
Right.
But you can obviously get complicated cases. But yeah, it's such a good and important starting point.
Yeah.
To ensure uniformity as well.
Right. I also see quite often a little bit of duplication. that whether it's the same question being asked, but just a different way, especially if the client, especially with onboarding forms, or you're getting one person to sign off, and then you're also having to get another, maybe one person signs off because they're a PEP, but then somebody else has to sign up because they're high risk. Could that be eliminated, that duplication?
Yeah.
And of course, sometimes the onboarding process is, again, about business risk, credit risk, reputation risk, not just AML and terrorist financing risk. And also just this is how we've always done it mentality.
So that is such a bugbear of mine. Never say that to me.
Yeah. So yeah, I hear that phrase a lot too.
Yeah.
So if you are trying to improve your current processes, you may have to ask those questions. Well, why are we doing it this way? And you may have to pick your battles as well. Sometimes you just can't, you just got to work with the culture in your company. Maybe you've got other divisions, departments that you have to work with. So you may have to pick your battles and just do an improvement at a time instead of all at once. So which is perfectly fine too.
Yeah.
Any other ideas for improving processes that we haven't kind of mentioned here?
I think just touching on that duplication. I think that certainly you see that a lot in long running firms where processes get laid on top of processes, and I think in those cases get a fresh pair of eyes on everything, even if it's like a any staff member. It doesn't even have to be external, but get a staff member who's joined recently to have a look and talk through that stuff as a newbie.
Right.
And just kind of freshen it up and don't just keep adding and adding and adding. Make sure that everything you've got there is entirely essential.
Right.
Otherwise, you've just got this really burdensome process that nobody enjoys.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So we'll take some questions. Right now, I don't have any questions, but I'm sure some might come in as we go on. I'm looking at somebody wrote a comment, and of course, it probably came in when we were talking about something. They're talking about the assets. Maybe it was an automatic risk trigger that if they had assets over $1 billion, they were immediately high risk. Below that was low risk, they say. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Nothing in between.
is what's that?
Nothing in between.
Nothing in between, exactly. So if they're really wealthy, they're high risk. If they're not so wealthy, they're low risk. Yeah, I can see that being questioned by an auditor. Still don't have any new questions coming in, unless I'm just missing them. But thank you for that comment. Sorry, I'm having a hard time viewing my my screen here.
Hi, Kimberly. It's Tom here, just jumping in. There are a couple of questions there.
Okay, sorry, I'm not seeing any.
You can scroll through.
Yeah, for some reason it's not letting me scroll through. Do you mind asking the questions, Tom?
Sure, as long as you promise to answer them.
No.
Should there be a certain percentage of high/medium/low risk clients overall in a firm's book of business?
Oh, that's a great question.
That was asked by Samantha.
I will say that I don't think you should ever have no high risks. As a matter of fact, I think that could be a trigger for some auditors if you say you have no high risk. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think really, because it's not about obviously reaching certain percentages, is it, of each of those, but your firm would do well to have a risk appetite document, a statement of some description. It doesn't have to be massive, but just something where you really set out what you're willing to take on. And then, you can see from your percentages of if you're going past that. But yeah, you might say, if any customer that we're onboarding falls into anything above low risk, we're not going to onboard them. So you could conceivably have only low risk in your portfolio, but you'd have to have a document like you said, Kimberly, because an auditor would kind of want to understand that.
Right.
The document would say, we don't take on, I've seen that before. Some businesses say, we just simply don't take on high risk clients. So if they come up in the risk matrix as high risk, they're not going to be onboarded.
Right. And I think you need to also remember to log those that you decline.
Absolutely.
So you can show your auditor or your regulator, your auditor, look, we have had people come on, but we've turned them away because they, according to our matrix or according to our scoring method, they fell into the high risk. So these were the ones that came in, logged who they are, when they came on, what factors made them high risk, and document that you did, deny the business.
Yeah, that's super important point, because I see that often in terms of processes, that's usually completely missing from AML policies, is exiting business and declining business. Because yes, in any situation you must, like you just said, state why you did that. But then more importantly, it could be for reasons of suspicions. And if you just exited because you're suspicious, but then you didn't file a report, well, that's a problem. So you need to be really clear about why you're doing things and how you followed up if you needed to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. And as far as like having a percentage, are you seeing any kind of percentage threshold that firms have, or different types of firms, or are they saying,
No,
we'll take on 5% or we'll take on 10%?
I don't usually see that. So it's a really interesting question, because I don't typically see that. It's usually just to do with what they're willing to take on and what their services are. So, firms vary. Some firms, their products are pretty low risk, and other firms, they are by their nature offering pretty high risk products, and so they are going to have big percentages of high risk clients. But their processes, the important thing about it is that your processes need to cope with that, and your expertise need to cope with that as well. So that's really the side you're looking at it from.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's very interesting, because I remember when we were showing our technology to a regulator once, one of the things that they definitely wanted to see on the main dashboard was the percentage of high risk clients in that's maintaining that system. And he specifically said it's because if we have somebody who has like 20% high risk clients, we're going to be then looking at the quality of their risk processes and their budget. Do they have the resources? Do they have the tools to take on a larger percentage of high risk clients?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Exactly.
Yeah. Now that was like 8 years ago, so I'm sure that's probably still very much the same. So if you do have a high percentage of high risk clients, you're going to want to be able to back up to a regulator to show that you have the resources to manage that. And that will be the ongoing reviews, the screening, and the day-to-day, onboarding process as well. Okay,
yeah,
I have a statement here. Somebody did clarify, and thank you very much for this wording. When we were talking about delivery channels, and I said delivery channels kind of mean a little bit different to some people. They write acquisition channel versus delivery channel, and I think that's very, very good phrasing as far as you want to look at your acquisition, how you acquire the client, versus the delivery channel, which is how you you provide that product or service to them. So thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Tom, any others? I'm sure there's others. Oh, here's one I can see. They kind of just pop up. See if I can read the question. It says, assessing risk when there are various triggering factors. For example, PEP, who is a director of a publicly traded company and or its subsidiary, does the higher risk factor override the lower? Oh, that's a good question. So if I'm understanding the question, it's like if you have a director who is a PEP, does that high risk rating of the PEP then transfer to the company?
Yeah, it depends on. Yeah, so if it's a director of the company, you've got to look at what you're doing for that company, What because if it's a massive company and you're not actually, and there's a sector that director's got nothing to do with that is engaging your services, we might have to look at it differently to, say, a smaller firm where that director is the person you're dealing with. If that makes sense. I'm maybe not explaining myself very well, but you've got to look at all of those aspects. I mean, essentially, if there's a PEP involved, yeah, your customer, that company is a PEP. You would apply that PEP label to it. But there are lots of factors to consider in that case.
Yeah. So maybe you would make the company high risk. Are you saying that you would make the company high risk if there's a PEP involved?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a proper PEP, a proper high, let's say, the highest
like
of PEP.
tier 1 PEP as opposed to
exactly
as opposed to like a family member of PEP or something.
Yeah, or just the real lower sort of in the hierarchy. If it's in your processes as a tier 1 PEP, then that is part of the company. A director directs a firm, so that sort of says it all. That firm is your customer and a PEP is directing it, so it should be high risk.
What if there was like so let's forget like the PEP status. What if you had somebody who was higher risk because they are just from a certain nationality? That's higher risk. We'll pick on Russia as an example. Let's say you've determined Russia is high risk, so anybody from Russia is high risk. Not that that's how you should do it, but if that was your case, does that and you have one Russian director on the board of maybe a UK company that's otherwise low risk? Would you make that company high risk?
Great example. Again, you are looking, we keep saying the same thing really, don't we? But you're looking at all the different factors. So, Russian nationality, but does that director live in Russia? What does the company do? I mean, you just said in your example that it's otherwise low risk. So, perhaps what it's using, what services it's using, and where it's transacting to and from are not high risk. So why would that single factor make it high risk?
Yeah. Okay. I think we're on the same page there. So I think the short answer is case by case. Which a phrase I really despise, but unfortunately that is just the case unless we knew more about what your firm is, because that's the problem with risk rating is that there's no one size fits all for every firm, every industry, every jurisdiction. It really is down to what does your business do, what products do you provide, and who's behind your client. If you've got a client. Okay.
I think just that starting point, as long as you get your kind of risk matrix in a really sort of good condition that's really suitable to your company and your customers and services and what have you, it's the best starting place you can have. But there are always going to be more complicated scenarios, aren't there, that might fall outside of that matrix.
Okay. The next question, and just kind of going back to that, if you are somebody who's trying to put together your risk assessment program and you're new to your industry, again, this is where, reaching out to a consultant, usually most jurisdictions have, very good consultants, compliance consultants, getting just some feedback on what you've written. I think that is a very good investment, because you're going to have to pay them, but it's a very good investment, especially if it's going to stop you from getting an audit or a repeat audit, and of course with the regulators having so much pressure on them to prove that they are, penalizing and fining and auditing. It's good just to have a second pair of eyes, especially if you're in a really small firm who does not have a huge department and multiple sets of eyes on compliance. I think that's a good investment to do.
Definitely.
Yeah. Another question has come in. They ask, do you suggest transparent overviews for high-risk clients? I may have heard wrong, but we request for all new clients. And transparent overviews, to me, that's just down to the due diligence. You're getting more than just the KYC, such as, knowing somebody's name, address, and nationality. But you're also, again, looking at, what products you're providing to them. That's part of the due diligence. And of course, your sanctions check, and you might have to do, so you might be doing some adverse media checks depending on the screening solution that you're using, or you may even just be doing like a quick Google review, if you're still relying on that, which I think has its pros and cons. But I don't know, did you have any responses? I mean, to me, it's that when you say, you said they use the word transparent overviews, that digging down into the clients, I mean,
Yeah,
depends on how
that
deep
depends.
they're going.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what your firm does, really, doesn't it? I mean, when I've worked in corporate services and trust businesses, you would do that every single time because of the nature of the business.
Product, yeah,
It's much higher risk than,
right.
So yeah, you basically everyone's getting EDD in effect.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it really depends on what you're offering and what your customer base is.
Yeah, and of course, like if you're a small bank, just providing a checking account to if you're crediting, you wouldn't want to do that. So again, that's very much dependent on the service that you're providing. Okay. Tom, can you tell if I have any other questions? Oh, wait, here's one. Do you think manual underwriting and AML risk screening are more riskier than automated screening? Manual underwriting and AML risk screening are more riskier than automated screening. Oh, I think there's pros and cons to both. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, my thoughts are you've got to, again, depending on the business, you should have a mixture of both, really. If you're a big business with many transactions, you've just got to have automated systems like that, and maybe verification systems, and certainly screening tools in pretty much all cases. But then you'll want to, and that will give you kind of daily alerts, your real-time alerts of things that might be going on after you've programmed in your rules and thresholds and what have you. But then you'll want to do kind of retrospective checks as well, which are more likely to be manual. So typically the best solution, again, as I say, depending on the size of the firm, is a mixture of the two. Right.
And the one thing I would add too, again, working with technology as I get more and more into technology, is you really need to understand when you do have the automated screening tools or any technology, understand your settings. And because if you are getting too many hits or results with screening, your settings might be too low. If you're not getting enough, they're too high. You understand which databases are being screened, what information is going into those databases, and why, and how those screening providers work. Again, as technology kind of improves and gets better and better, those things are changing. So you might have to check your settings a couple times a year.
Definitely. And any decent provider is going to help you with that as well, because that's that should be part of the service. Helping you with your settings based on your firm's requirements. It's always about your firm's requirements and your customer base and your services. But also,
sorry, go ahead. Go on. I was going to say, one example that we had, sorry, we're talking over each other. One example we had was we had somebody, their screening thresholds were set too low. I think it was like at 72. And the result was, given the number that they had, was it was like 90,000 hits. Well, small compliance team, I mean, that would have taken them a year just to go through those hits that, happened. So we were able to help them remove anything from that had that 72 up to, we then changed their setting to 90 and reduced like all those false positives from 90,000 from 90,000
Yeah.
reviews. So that's something that your provider should be kind of, as you say, should be able to help you with, so you don't have to clear all those hits. But still, again, tweak your settings so that you don't keep getting these, a stupid amount of hits that clearly are not hits. So, they're false positives with something.
Yeah, and you're not missing anything important as well. So it's just getting that fine balance, isn't it?
Yeah, but at the same time, and of course, I made the comment, I think a Google review has its pros and cons. Especially as events take place, you might do a Google review and find out one of your corporate clients is in liquidation, but it hasn't hit the screening database provider yet, that information. So so that's why that combination of both is good. Good question though. All right, let me see if I've got anything else. I've got one. Israel has started their own freedom convoy. Oh, okay. So this is those the convoy drove from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on Monday and converged on Parliament. Wow, yeah, these convoys are popping up all over. I didn't realize Israel was as well. So those are those trucker convoys. So it's very, very interesting of seeing what's going to happen with all that politics. Okay, Tom, have I missed any? Again, it's really hard for me to see these questions.
One that has popped up twice is, given the pandemic, would you consider video conferencing or a video Teams meeting, etc., as face-to-face business?
I would. And again, I think that's just going to be one of those things, but I mean, we can't get together, at the end of the day. So yeah, I personally would. What about you?
Yeah. I think I'm going to go my stock phrase again. It always depends on the person you're meeting. So, if there's anything sort of high risk about that customer, are they kind of contacting you from where you'd expect them to be contacting you from? I think in most cases I'd agree with you, Kimberly. It's face to face. You're meeting them. As long as you've ID'd them, you've verified them properly, you've gathered evidence that their business is what they say it is, they're who they say they are, you're absolutely sure that the documents you have are real, genuine documents, then there's not much more that can be done, is there?
Right.
So yeah, generally speaking, yes, but there could always be slight situations where you just want to be a bit more careful. And I think in those cases, because you still wouldn't be able to go and meet them necessarily, it might just be a case of gathering further documentary evidence to support who they are.
Yeah. Okay. I am seeing another question that's coming up, kind of going back to the PEPs, and I think the underlying question is what if the PEP is regulated? So the FSA, do you still have FSA regulated individuals?
FCA, yeah.
FCA, yeah. So that dates me right there.
FCA. Still the same beast.
Yeah, exactly. So they're saying, what if the PEP is regulated or the CEO of a listed company? So obviously listed companies are highly, watched and regulated. So if you have somebody who's a PEP and the PEP is regulated, maybe by the FCA, or they're the director or CEO of a listed entity, would their high risk status, well, gosh, thinking about this too, like in Cayman, for instance, if they're listed, you can do what's called simplified due diligence, or at least you could a few years ago.
That's right. The same here, yeah.
So could you still apply that simplified due diligence method to a corporate client, if the PEP is regulated?
So there's two different things going on there, isn't there? Because a PEP is going to be typically a person, and a listed company, a regulated firm, is going to be the firm itself. So yes, so you're going to be looking at, where is that firm regulated, where is that human PEP regulated, but also what type of PEP are they, what type of business are they doing, what services do they want from you, And you've got to think about why a PEP is a PEP. Well, they're higher
Right.
risk as a PEP because they're at higher risk of perhaps corruption or something like that, or getting things done, not going through the correct channels and what have you. That's why a PEP is considered a PEP. So you have to think about, in terms of the business that you're offering, does that PEP status, forgetting the regulatory status, does the PEP status pose some kind of risk in relation to what your business will be with them?
Right. Okay. I was just trying to think. I wonder too if okay, so you have that individual who's a CEO. So they're not necessarily your client, but maybe you could just monitor that individual more frequently, and but keep the company itself as low or medium, or maybe even maybe bump it up to medium risk, even though you still apply the simplified due diligence method because it's listed. Maybe
I
that's
think
probably something I would explore.
I mean, if there was nothing else about extracting the fact that this example CEO is a PEP, and there's nothing else that's kind of particularly high risk, then you could do something like that. And just as we've said many times throughout this webinar, just make sure you're documenting it and the reasons for the decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Okay, hope that answers that question. Let me see if I'm missing anything else. Tom, is there any question that you see I've missed?
I'll jump in with one more if we've got time. Regulated nominees, how far should you go to identify the UBO if the local laws of the country of the nominee do not allow for the sharing of UBO information?
Oh, that is a tough one.
Hang on, let me try and understand this. Are we talking about if you've got a nominee shareholder in a corporate structure? Is this what we're talking about?
So can you repeat the question, Tom?
Yep. Regulated nominees. How far should you go to identify the unofficial the UBO if the local laws of the country of the nominee do not allow for the sharing of UBO information?
Yeah, I mean, the local laws, as in if it's outside of your own jurisdiction, and neither here nor there in that case, it's your jurisdiction that matters. And here in the UK, you have to know who ultimately owns the customer, the corporate customer, and that's the end of the story. So you need to go through every single layer, however intricate that is, and you'd have to start asking some questions if it's super intricate. And if you've got nominees in place, why are they there would be a question. I know that's kind of outside what you're asking, but you'd need to start asking yourself why that, why it's opaque like that, what the purpose is, what the rationale is,
I think I've even had this situation, and again, it depends on the country where that nominee is being regulated, where they fit in your risk appetite. Again, I think there's ways around it to where you could say, okay, well, it's still a highly regulated country. We're comfortable doing business with this particular regulated nominee. We've done our due diligence on them. Nothing's coming up. I think there's ways around it, but again, it goes back to what are you comfortable with?
Yeah, but by their nature, they're acting on behalf of the actual economic ultimate beneficial owner, right? In that scenario.
Yeah, and I guess you're right.
You have to know who that person is, or people are. You have to, and there's well, certainly here and in Europe, you have to. And there's no way around that at all.
So
because you've got to know it's the money flow.
You can't take the business, really.
No, absolutely, you can't take the business. If you cannot get to the real end person or people, you can't take the business on.
Okay.
I think we've had a few more comments on that. I think it's associated to that. They further commented to say the client is, say, a Swiss bank acting as nominee. they also commented they provide a comfort letter.
Yeah, no, sorry,
Uh,
those days are pretty much over here.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah,
they
I
could
guess you're right
provide,
with the beneficial ownership
yeah,
regulations and so many.
there aren't any scenarios where you cannot know who your customer is, and that's it.
Yeah.
And you know that if you're using, because there are different terms and what have you, but you know, the term nominee means they're acting on behalf of someone else, and you have to know who that someone else is. Now, many moons ago, you know, certainly in the business I worked in, you know, and I'm going back 20 years, those questions weren't asked, and they weren't, you know, and that was pretty normal for that environment. And yeah, and you could have numbered accounts at the bank and things like that, no names on them and everything, but that's just simply not able to be done now. So yeah, I can't emphasize that strongly enough.
Yeah. Kind of like the days of bearer shares are gone now.
Yeah, yeah, quite. Yeah,
Whereas 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we could still do those. All right.
yeah.
Any other last questions? And that, because we're running half an hour, we're going up beyond half an hour. I mean, an hour and a half now. So
It's an exciting topic.
yeah, it is. It really is exciting. Okay, Tom, two more polling questions.
I was going to say, I believe that's all of the questions answered, and commenting that we've gone over half an hour. It's great to see so many people still in attendance.
Yeah, no, exactly. So we've captured their attention. So let's just have the last two polling questions, if you don't mind, Tom. Again, we're just wanting to know if you feel more confident about your risk assessment procedures, or if you realize you need to make some changes, if you don't mind. Kind of help us know gauge if we're kind of helping with these discussions and ways that we can improve them. So yeah, this is good. If you want to go ahead and close that one, Tom. At least half of you are feeling that you are feeling a bit more confident, and 45% are saying you think you need to consider more factors. So I'm glad we could help you at least realize that, either feel more confident or realize you need to make some improvements. And also, this next one is just to kind of help us gauge a little bit about where, if I need to be focusing on some other discussions. So if you like to dive deeper about maybe screening or drafting policies and procedures, beneficial ownership, kind of, again, that kind of came up. And another one, any new industries and technologies, because we're always keeping an eye on new industries and technologies as they do mature. Fantastic. So it's really kind of a fairly even split there. So, okay, excellent. So if you just want to show that one, I'm just kind of showing basically 60% about drafting policies and procedures. That's good to know, because that's going to be one of our next ones coming up in March. More people want to know about beneficial ownership, as well as screening and new industries and technologies. Fantastic. Thank you for answering those. For anybody who is interested in Corinna's services, she is a consultant, and these are some of the services she provides. You can go to Conventium, AMLcompliance.com. Sorry, it's just Conventium.com. And I will be putting in an email follow-up, her email address, if you want to reach out to her as well. And that is it for today's broadcast. And again, to our audience, I want to thank you for joining us. We do know your time is valuable, so we appreciate it. And I apologize, we keep going over. I should start telling people it's going to be an hour and a half. But we do hope you found today's broadcast helpful, and that you can take the information presented today and strengthen your AML and counterterrorism compliance policies. We also want you to be confident in your customer onboarding, risk assessment, and monitoring procedures. So we do hope today helped you. Our next scheduled webinar, I do have Angela Mealy of RiskPass in the Cayman Islands. She's going to be joining me to discuss disaster recovery policies and procedures. And as we all know, the past 2 years have taught us how important these policies and procedures are. And of course, there's only continued natural disasters and technological threats. So, we really need to have these kind of pinned down, maybe do a review of how you dealt with the pandemic, and again, strengthen those disaster recovery situations in place that you do have in place. Again, I'll be including this a link to this particular webinar, sorry, in our follow-up email, and that usually goes out on Friday, so please keep an eye out for that. And again, there might be another one before this, so I'm working with the guest on speaker and times, so you can keep an eye out. We will send you out an email invite to that. Thank you again to Corinna. Thank you so much for joining us. I thought the conversation was very, very informative.